They weren't pretty. They weren't glamorous. And half the time, if you were flying inside one, it felt like the aircraft wanted to tear itself apart. Yet these machines rewrote naval warfare, shattered enemy convoys, pinpointed targets long before precision strike existed, and in some cases turned the tide of the entire Pacific War. Today, we're counting down the greatest dive bombers of World War II, the ones that didn't just drop bombs, but changed history every time they screamed toward the earth. This is WW2 Rewind, and we're diving in. The Vought SB-2U Vindicator holds a strange place in aviation history. On paper, it looked like the future, America's first monoplane dive bomber, sleek, clean-lined, and a dramatic leap forward from the biplanes it replaced. But beneath that modern silhouette was an aircraft still trying to figure out what it wanted to be. Too slow to outrun fighters, too lightly built to absorb punishment, and lacking the ruggedness a true dive bomber needed. The Vindicator entered the Second World War already carrying the weight of obsolescence. But wars are not fought on paper, and the men who flew Vindicators refused to let the machine define them. By the outbreak of the Pacific War, the Vindicator was a relic. Crews joked that it had the heart of a lion but the bones of a bird, and they weren't far off. Its fabric-covered control surfaces buckled under high stress. The airframe twisted during steep dives. The landing gear was notoriously delicate, and its top speed barely cresting 250 miles per hour left pilots with the uncomfortable knowledge that almost anything with wings could outrun them. Even worse, its dive brakes were primitive, making every attack a delicate balancing act between accuracy and structural survival. Yet when the war came, America fought with what it had. And what it had in many places were Vindicators. Nowhere did the aircraft's story burn brighter or bleed harder than at the Battle of Midway. While Navy squadrons arrived equipped with newer aircraft like the SBD Dauntless, the Marine Corps at Midway was forced to rely on their aging SB-2US. These were machines that had no business facing the Japanese fleet, and the pilots knew it. Every time they strapped in, they understood they were flying into the teeth of a superior enemy with an inferior aircraft, but they flew anyway, based at Eastern Island. The Marines used their Vindicators in a desperate series of missions meant to slow the Japanese advance. The men of VMSB 241 pushed their aircraft harder than any engineer ever intended, with limited altitude to begin their dives. Sometimes as low as 1,500 feet, they faced the terrifying reality that if they didn't release their bombs precisely, they could be destroyed by the shockwave of their own weapons. Imagine diving toward a Japanese cruiser, the ocean rising fast, anti-aircraft fire stitching the sky around you, and knowing that your aircraft might not survive the pullout even if the enemy never touched you. But still, they pressed on. Pilots reported the wings shuddering violently, the wind screaming through the cockpit as they forced the unsteady Vindicators into steep dives to gain accuracy. Some released too close. Others didn't have enough speed to escape the blast. Many limped home full of holes or with engines coughing their last breaths as they clawed back toward Midway's battered runway. The Vindicator didn't win decisive victories. It didn't sink fleets or change the direction of the war, but it did something just as important. It bought time. Every sortie flown by those Marines kept the Japanese off balance for another hour, another day, just long enough for more capable aircraft and better prepared forces to assemble. And in war, time is priceless. The SB-2U Vindicator was outdated, underpowered, and unforgiving. But the men who flew it, those Marines who climbed into a machine, already past its prime, transformed it into something more than metal and wings. They turned it into a symbol of grit, sacrifice, and the brutal improvisation of early war combat. The Vindicator didn't earn its place in history through performance. It earned it through the bravery of the crews who refused to give up on it, and that is why it stands on this list. Before the name Helldiver became synonymous with the lumbering SB-2C beast, there was another American aircraft that carried that title, a machine from an entirely different world. The Curtiss SBC Helldiver wasn't just outdated when World War II erupted. It was practically prehistoric. the last operational biplane bomber in the U.S. Navy's inventory. It represented the twilight of an era when drag wires, wooden wings, and open cockpits defined naval aviation. By 1941, the SBC looked more at home in an aviation museum than on the deck of a frontline carrier. While the rest of the world was embracing fast monoplanes with all-metal construction, retractable landing gear, and enclosed cockpits, the Helldiver stubbornly held on to the past. A top speed barely brushing 230 miles per hour meant it couldn't outrun modern fighters. Its biplane wings created drag that robbed it of energy in dive ease, and its fragile structure full of wood, fabric, and tensioned wires made the aircraft vulnerable to even modest anti-aircraft fire. But war doesn't wait for perfect machines. And in the desperate, chaotic months following Pearl Harbor, the United States needed every airframe it could put into the sky. So the Navy sent the Helldiver into combat. At first, no one expected much. The aircraft had been relegated to training squadrons, reserve units, and second-line duties for years. Yet in the darkness of early 1942, with American forces reeling across the Pacific, the Helldiver suddenly found itself pressed into roles it had never been designed for. It flew from scattered island bases and remote airfields, often maintained by ground crews lacking proper tools, parts, or even manuals. Many aircraft were patched together with whatever was on hand canvas, wire, improvised metal panels because replacements simply didn't exist, and still, they took off. Helldiver pilots in the Philippines became some of the first Americans to bring the fight back to the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. They launched low-level bombing raids against advancing enemy formations, striking columns, supply dumps, and landing beaches. Against these lightly defended targets, the old biplane proved surprisingly effective. It could loiter over the battlefield longer than faster aircraft. It could dive steeply enough for accurate bombing runs. And its slow speed, usually a liability, actually helped when threading through broken terrain or attacking jungle positions where speed meant overshooting the target. But against modern fighters, the story was very different. The Mitsubishi A6M0 could close the distance on an SBC Helldiver in seconds. Pilots described the experience as standing still in midair while a shark circled. The Helldiver couldn't climb fast enough to escape, couldn't dive fast enough to shake pursuit, and couldn't outmaneuver a Zero in any dimension. When Japanese fighters appeared, the only hope was terrain masking hugging the ground, twisting between hills or slipping into cloud cover. Even then, most encounters ended the same way, an aircraft riddled with holes limping home, or one that didn't return at all. Yet the Helldiver's story is not one of failure. It is one of resilience. The aircraft flew convoy escort missions across submarine-infested waters, providing reconnaissance and harassment against enemy submarines when no other aircraft were available. It carried messages, evacuated wounded personnel, and served as the eyes of scattered American garrisons. Sometimes it carried bombs. Other times it carried nothing but hope. Crews knew they were flying a relic. They understood the risks. But they also understood that in warfare's opening moments, survival often hinges on holding the line just long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The SBC Helldiver helped by that time. It was obsolete. It was underpowered. It belonged to a bygone era, but it fought anyway, and in those early desperate months of World War II, that was enough to earn the Curtiss SBC Helldiver its place in history, not as a technological marvel, but as a symbol of determination when the odds were impossible and the world was falling apart. Some aircraft earn their place in history through courage, innovation, or the feats of the men who flew them, and then there is the Brewster SB-2, a Buccaneer. Few machines of World War II inspired such universal frustration, disappointment, and, in some cases, outright hatred. To pilots, ground crews, and commanders alike, the Buccaneer quickly became a symbol of everything that could go wrong when bureaucracy, optimism, and flawed engineering collide. On paper, the SB-2A looked promising. Brewster aircraft promised the Navy a fast, rugged dive bomber capable of matching or exceeding the best in the world. Expectations were high. Funding flowed. Factories expanded. The U.S. and its allies desperately needed modern aircraft. And Brewster assured everyone that the Buccaneer would deliver, but reality had different plans. The moment pilots took the SB-2A into the air, the illusion cracked. The aircraft shook at cruising speed, vibrated violently in turns, and felt dangerously unstable in diving, an unforgivable flaw for something calling itself a dive bomber. Mechanics quickly learned to dread the maintenance logs. Rivets popped loose. Panels warped. The airframe twisted under even moderate G-forces. Even on the ground, the Buccaneer felt fragile. As if simply sitting still was an engineering challenge it barely survived. Pilots joked, darkly, that, if you ever had to fly an SB-2A into combat, the safest place you could stand was directly beneath it. Because it would almost certainly break apart long before reaching the target. It sounds like an exaggeration. Unfortunately, it wasn't. A machine that never found a purpose. The U.S. Navy tested the Buccaneer extensively. The more they flew it, the worse the assessments became. By the time production aircraft rolled off the line, the Navy had already moved on. They refused to use it operationally and declared it unfit for combat. In an era where almost anything with wings was being pushed into frontline service, the SB-2A was rejected outright. That alone speaks volumes. Still, America had signed contracts. Money had been spent. And the Allies needed aircraft, any aircraft. So the U.S. began shipping SB-2As overseas. Hoping someone else could find a use for them, the British received the Buccaneer under the name Bermuda. And their reaction was immediate and brutal. They wanted nothing to do with it. Test pilots were appalled by its performance and openly questioned its structural integrity. Many were flown once, maybe twice, before being quietly rolled to the edge of airfields and left to bake in the sun. The Royal Air Force didn't even bother sending the SB-2A to frontline squadrons. Instead, they assigned it to training units, then quickly discovered it wasn't safe even for that. One RAF report bluntly concluded that the Bermuda was not suitable for operational use under any circumstances. Then there were the Dutch, who also received shipments of Buccaneers while operating from Australia. At least the Dutch tried to give the aircraft a role patrol, reconnaissance, bombing practice, but the results were the same. Attempts to make the SB-2A useful always ended in disappointment. Crews preferred older aircraft, even pre-war designs, over the brand-new Buccaneer. Some Dutch officers later admitted that ground crews breathed a sigh of relief whenever a mission was reassigned to a more reliable aircraft. In some units, SB-2As didn't even make it to the flight line. They were parked at the edges of airfields, slowly stripped for spare parts, or simply abandoned. For many pilots, the Buccaneer became a depressing reminder that not every wartime project produced a hero. A cautionary tale in aluminum and rivets. The Brewster SB-2A Buccaneer earns its place on this list not because it accomplished great deeds, but because it didn't. Because it shows that the history of World War II aviation isn't just a gallery of legends like the Dauntless, the Stuka, the Val, or the Avenger. It also contains failures, aircraft rushed into production, machines plagued by design flaws, and weapons that never lived up to their promise. The Buccaneer became a lesson learned the hard way. It demonstrated the danger of wartime optimism. The limits of a small manufacturer stretched too thin. The consequences of an aircraft designed by committee, adapted endlessly, and burdened with unrealistic expectations. It showed that not everything built during wartime was automatically brilliant, heroic, or effective, and in that sense, the SB-2A's legacy matters, because history isn't just the story of the winners. It's also the story of what didn't work and why the Brewster Buccaneer never became a feared dive bomber. It never sank enemy shipping or shaped the outcome of a decisive battle. Instead, it became something else. A reminder that bravery and engineering excellence don't always travel together, and that even in a war full of innovation, some machines were destined to fail before they ever left the ground. The Vought SB-2U Vindicator was an aircraft born in the narrow space between innovation and obsolescence. A transitional design from the 1930s, It represented a moment when aviation technology was moving faster than industry could adapt. The Vindicator's sleek monoplane shape suggested speed, strength, and modernity. But that promise proved deceptive. Beneath its clean lines, the SB-2U was still deeply rooted in an older generation of engineering, slower, lighter, and far more fragile than wartime combat demanded. Yet for all its shortcomings, the Vindicator would earn its place in history not through what it accomplished, but through what its pilots dared to do with it. In peacetime, the SB-2U served its purpose well enough. It flew reconnaissance missions, patrolled coastlines, and trained new pilots in the techniques of carrier aviation. With its simple construction and predictable handling, it became a familiar sight on American flight decks during the late 1930s, as the U.S. Navy pushed forward into the age of all-metal monoplanes and high-performance dive bombers. The Vindicator quietly filled the gap, doing the unglamorous work of a fleet still evolving. When the war erupted, however, the Vindicator suddenly found itself in a world it was never designed to survive. Still, it flew from 1941 into early 1942. The SB-2U carried out anti-submarine patrols along the American coastline and over the Caribbean. The aircraft's slow speed made it a poor hunter, but it was steady, reliable, and able to loiter over the ocean for long stretches. These patrols rarely made headlines, yet they helped keep vital shipping lanes open during some of the darkest months of the war, when German U-boats prowled aggressively and Allied defenses were still uncoordinated. But the Vindicator's defining chapter came during the Battle of Midway. There, on the tiny outpost of Eastern Island, Marine Squadron VMSB-241 prepared for a fight they knew they were not equipped to win. Their aircraft, the elderly SB-2U and the slightly newer SBD, Dauntless, were all that stood between the advancing Japanese fleet and the survival of Midway itself. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the Marines launched their Vindicators into a sky darkened by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Their target, one of the most powerful naval fleets ever assembled, the Vindicator's shortcomings became immediately apparent. It struggled to climb to combat altitude. It lacked the armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural strength needed for steep, high-speed dives. And at just over 240 miles per hour, it was helpless against the Mitsubishi A6M0, which could overtake it with ease. But the Marines pressed on. They flew low to avoid interception. They dove without proper altitudes. They released their bombs in the face of overwhelming fire, knowing full well that their chances of returning were slim. These attacks inflicted little physical damage on the Japanese fleet, but they forced enemy formations to maneuver, scattered their defenses, and contributed to the eventual opening that allowed American dive bombers to strike later that morning. It was bravery in its rawest form. Pilots fighting not with the aircraft they wanted, but with the aircraft they had. The Vindicator did not win Midway. It did not change the balance of naval aviation. But the men of VMSB-241 proved something far greater, that courage can rise from even the most outdated machine, and that in war, determination often matters just as much as hardware. Today, the Vindicator stands as a reminder of a desperate moment in American history, when insufficient aircraft were flown by men of extraordinary grit. It is remembered not for what it was, but for the bravery of those who took it into battle anyway. When most of the world thought of dive bombers, they pictured aircraft like the Stuka, the Dauntless, or the Japanese Vought machines built for a single purpose: to dive, release their bombs, and survive if luck allowed. The Soviets, however, approached the problem differently. In the Soviet Union, an aircraft was expected to do far more than a single specialized job. It had to dive, level bomb, escort other planes, run reconnaissance, and even defend itself when needed. The Petlyakov Pe-2, born from this philosophy, became the embodiment of versatility on the Eastern Front. From the moment it rolled off the production line, the Pe-2 impressed pilots with its sleek lines and speed. It could outpace many German fighters at altitude, though it was by no means invincible. Its design allowed for both shallow and steep dive-bombing runs, adapting to the needs of each mission. This flexibility made it a nightmare for German forces. Armored columns, supply convoys, fortified positions, none could hide from the relentless precision of a well-flown Pe-2 equipped with a crew of 3 and capable of carrying up to 2,000 pounds of bombs internally. The Pe-2's effectiveness was multiplied by its adaptability. Unlike Western dive bombers, which were often highly specialized and vulnerable once past the initial dive, the Pe-2 could continue to contribute even under fire. It could defend itself with multiple machine guns, perform reconnaissance to gather vital intelligence, and coordinate attacks with other Soviet bombers and fighters. In essence, it was not just a weapon, it was a small flying command post capable of influencing the battlefield in several ways simultaneously. The sheer numbers tell part of the story. Over 11,000 Pe-2 South were produced during the war, making it one of the most manufactured twin-engine bombers in Soviet history. Its presence on the battlefield was constant. German soldiers and officers alike learned to respect its arrival, knowing that the Pe-2 could appear suddenly, strike decisively, and vanish before reinforcements could respond. Unlike many Western dive bombers, which relied on extreme specialization for maximum effect, the Pe-2 derived its lethality from adaptability. It did many things well, and sometimes one aircraft's mission could involve multiple roles within a single sortie. Perhaps most remarkable was the human element. The crews of Pe-2 South, often young, sometimes barely trained, had to master a complex, fast, and demanding aircraft while flying in one of the most brutal theaters of the war. Anti-aircraft fire, the threat of Luftwaffe fighters, and the unforgiving conditions of the Eastern Front made every sortie a test of skill, courage, and endurance. Yet the Pe-2 delivered consistently, contributing to pivotal operations such as the Battle of Kursk, where it helped smash German armored thrusts, and throughout the Soviet summer offensives of 1944, where it harassed supply lines and supported rapid advances into Eastern Europe. In the end, the Pe-2 may not fit the romanticized image of a purpose-built dive bomber. It was not a pure machine designed for a single iconic attack. But what it lacked in purity, it made up for in versatility, reliability, and sheer battlefield impact. It could strike deep, defend itself, and support every layer of the Soviet war effort. All while being produced in staggering numbers, the Petlyakov Pe-2 earned its place in history as a dive bomber by adaptability, a jack of all trades that mastered the chaotic and unforgiving environment of the Eastern Front. Fast, deadly, and endlessly versatile, it proved that in war, sometimes the aircraft that can do everything is the one that changes the most. If the Zero could drop bombs, it would look a lot like the Judy. It was fast, extremely fast, relying on speed rather than armor. Early models had almost no protection for the pilot, and the fuel tanks weren't self-sealing. A single hit could turn it into a torch, but when it got through, it was among the most accurate naval dive bombers of the war. The D4Y carried out some of the most devastating late-war Japanese strikes, and in the chaotic final stages, it even became a formidable kamikaze platform. The aircraft that should have been obsolete, but WASN single quotes slow compared to the Japanese Judy, underpowered compared to the Helldiver that replaced it. Small bomb load, old-fashioned cockpit, but every pilot who flew it trusted it with their life. The Dauntless was stable in a dive, predictable under stress, and could absorb punishment that would tear newer designs apart. At the Battle of Midway, it orchestrated one of the most decisive strikes in naval history, sending 4 Japanese carriers to the bottom in a single afternoon. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't fast, but it was reliable, accurate, and deadly. If you were an American sailor on December 7, 1941, this aircraft was the shape of terror. The D3 didn't have impressive stats on paper: slow, limited range, light defensive armament. But the VAL earned its reputation through sheer tactical execution. It crippled Battleship Row at Pearl Harbor, hammered British warships off Ceylon, and hit Allied positions throughout the South Pacific with ruthless precision. If the Zero dominated dogfights, The Val-dominated sea level held nicknamed the Beast, and for good reason. Early versions were unstable, overweight, and despised by every pilot forced to fly them. But once the bugs were ironed out, the Helldiver became exactly what the U.S. Navy needed: a fast, rugged, heavy-hitting dive bomber with real striking power. Carriers throughout 1944 and 1945 relied on it to smash Japanese warships, fortifications, convoys, anything that needed destroying. Not beloved, not graceful, but brutally effective. No aircraft defined dive bombing the way the Stuka did. Those wailing, mechanical sirens, the Jericho trumpets, were psychological weapons in their own right, turning every attack run into an air raid from hell. In the opening years of the war, the WW2 was unstoppable. In Poland, it cracked open defenses in hours. In France, it knifed through the Ardennes. In the Mediterranean, it terrorized Allied convoys. But when the Stuka faced modern fighters, its weaknesses were exposed: slow, poorly protected, unable to survive without air superiority. Yet its early impact was so massive, so unmatched, that even with its flaws, the Stuka remains the most iconic dive bomber ever built. These machines weren't perfect. Some were crude, some brilliant, some terrifying, and some barely airworthy. But every one of them shaped history in ways far bigger than their bomb loads. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the aircraft that changed the war from above, make sure you subscribe, because here on WW2 Rewind, we bring forgotten stories back to life.